His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to Sri Guru and Gauranga. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Samshayota viparyaso. Nishchaya smriti eva cha. Shvapa ityuchyate budhe. Lakshanam britaha pritak. Samshayosta viparyasyo. Nishchaya smriti eva cha. Shvapa ityuchyate budhe. Lakshanam britaha pritak. Samshayota viparyaso. Nishchaya smriti eva cha. Britaha. Lakshanam britaha pritak. Samshayota viparyaso. Nishchaya smriti eva cha. Shvapa ityuchyate budhe. Lakshanam vritita pritak. Samshayota viparyaso. Nishchaya smriti eva cha. Shvapa ityuchyate budhe. Lakshanam vritata pritak. Ladies? Give it a go. Samshayota viparyaso. Nishchaya smriti eva cha. Shvapa ityuchyate budhe. Lakshanam vritaha pritak. Samshayaha. Doubt. Ata. Then. Viparyasya. Misapprehension. Nishchayaha. Correct apprehension. Smriti. Memory. Eva. Also. Cha. And. Shvapaha. Sleep. Iti. Thus. Uchyate. Said. Buddhe. Of intelligence. Lakshanam. Characteristics. Vritaha. By their functions. Pritak. Different. Translation by Srila Prabhupada. Doubt, misapprehension, correct apprehension, memory, and sleep, as determined by their different functions, are said to be the distinct characteristics of intelligence. Translation responsively. Doubt, misapprehension, correct apprehension, memory and sleep, as determined by their different functions, are said to be the distinct characteristics of intelligence. Purport by Srila Prabhupada. Doubt is one of the important functions of intelligence. Blind acceptance of something does not give evidence of intelligence. Therefore, the word samshayaha is very important. in order to cultivate intelligence, one should be doubtful in the beginning. But doubting is not very favorable when information is received from the proper source. In Bhagavad Gita, the Lord says that doubting the words of the authority is the cause of destruction. As described in the Patanjali Yoga system, Paramana Viparya Vikalpa Nidra Smrityaha. By intelligence only, one can understand things as they are. By intelligence only, one can understand whether or not he is the body. The study to determine whether one's identity is spiritual or material begins in doubt. When one is able to analyze his actual position, the false identification with the body is detected. This is viparyasa. When false identification is detected, then real identification can be understood. Real understanding is described here as nishchayaha, or proved experimental knowledge. This experimental knowledge can be achieved when one has understood the false knowledge. By experimental or proved knowledge, one can understand that he is not the body, but spirit soul. Smriti means memory, and shwapa means sleep. Sleep is also necessary to keep the intelligence in working order. If there is no sleep, the brain cannot work nicely. In Bhagavad Gita, it is especially mentioned that persons who regulate eating, sleeping, and other necessities of the body in the proper proportion become very successful in the yoga process. These are some of the aspects of the analytical study of intelligence as described in both the Patanjali Yoga system and the Sankhya philosophy system of Kapiladev in Srimad Bhagavatam. Om Ganati Mirandash Chigananjana Shilakaya Chakshurunmilitam Janatajmai Shri Gurave Namaha Anchakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhuvayevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. So we've already been given a little bit of a little taster of this verse by Mukunda Maharaj the other day. He couldn't resist looking at it. It's an interesting verse. And also on Friday, Krishna Kirtan was also talking about intelligence. So today's verse mentions doubt, misapprehension, correct apprehension, memory, sleep as being the characteristics of intelligence. This word apprehension, where the verse talks of correct apprehension. To apprehend means to capture or grasp the essence of something, to understand it, to catch hold of the meaning. Usually we hear that word in connection with the police have apprehended somebody. They've grabbed hold of them. So our intelligence is there to help us grab hold of the real meaning behind stuff. Our intelligence allows us to understand when we have misapprehended something, when we have incorrectly understood it. Like when we come to the conclusion that we have misapprehended our position in the world, or we have misapprehended the very nature of ourself. This is the center, the very basis of why we are here. Humans and animals both show these functions of intelligence. We see the animals, though, they do it in their own way. Animals have heightened ability to apprehend, for example, when there is danger. They are highly skilled at that. Their lives depend on it. Their reflexes are infinitely faster than ours. So much faster. For the animal to misapprehend something can mean death. If they misapprehend, if they misconstrue the situation in front of them, there could be something there that's going to kill them. I mean, in the animal kingdom, it's the stronger eat the weaker, isn't it? The survival of the fittest. to understand if something is food or not. They have to, or something is dangerous. So, and also, the animals also show memory, which is described in the verse as another one of the characteristics of intelligence. Like I was thinking at my place, I put out a tray of seed out in the backyard for the birds. And like if I've been away for a few days or something like that, so the seed has run out, and I put some seed out, even after maybe has been like a week perhaps since I put seed there. But within a few hours, the birds are there. They remember in their little area of, their habitat, they remember places of food. So they have these same qualities of intelligence. Elephants are well known for their ability to remember stuff. Apparently, an elephant can remember one of its relatives many, many decades later, merely by the scent. Elephants apparently are not known to have very good eyesight, but their smell is very acute. And their memory, it's usually the matriarch in a herd of elephants who guides them around. And she remembers, like when they're in the desert or in the African plains, she remembers those places of water. Years and years and years later, she can sort of remember those maps because the rest of the herd's following her. But the animals, they're using their intelligence, their undoubted intelligence. They're using it, though, only in regards to their bodies, to stay alive, eating, sleeping, mating, defending, we know. So their intelligence is used in that sort of more local, limited way. But we have been given the gift of this human form of life. We've been given a particular type of intelligence where we can question how we are living our life. Like for most animals, if there's enough food, if they're safe, then that's pretty much content. They don't need more than that. But most humans, or not many humans, are satisfied simply to survive. It's just within our nature to ask these questions. When Prabhupada was present, I can still remember distinctly, there's so many things I can't remember, but when Prabhupada was here, I remember he'd be sitting there giving class, and he'd look around at all of us sitting there, and he'd sort of slowly look at each one of us, and he'd say, don't take this human birth for granted. He said, this human birth is very, very special. Don't waste it. On the other hand, we have these material scientists putting out theories. Most school kids are growing up with these sorts of theories. That as a human being, you're just another animal. Maybe you've got some more intelligence, but basically you're just another animal. I've even heard they describe this life is just a brief interlude between two periods of nothingness. There was nothing before you appeared, and there's nothing when you disappear. I mean, in other words, they're saying your life has absolutely no real meaning to it. Just was that ancient Indian philosopher, just get ghee, eat ghee, live what you can. So it's no wonder that young people are faced with such horrible negative ideas of what human life is about. In today's verse, Prabhupada begins his purport by outlining the importance of doubt as it applies to our intelligence. He says, blind acceptance of something doesn't give evidence of intelligence. So our process of surrendering to Krishna and Guru is not one of blind acceptance. That actually we approach the spiritual master, we approach the Shastra, and generally we accept bit by bit, little by little. We realize that actually everything that's been told to us from the Guru, from the Shastra, makes sense, and it's giving a good life. All of us share this common experience of beginning this human life, this human experience. The verse is talking about intelligence, but every single one of us are born into ignorance, like a little baby. What does a little baby know? It's described his consciousness is described as Annamaya. Yeah, you've all heard of that? Annamaya. The baby is aware of food. The body of the baby is telling it, I have to be fed. I have to stay alive. And there's no way that you can tell a baby, look, I'm just a little busy. I'm going to feed you in 5 minutes, okay? No need to freak out. It has no conception. It's just got to be fed. That's its consciousness. I need to stay alive. So those different koshas, there's many different types of intelligence, a bit like the skin of an onion. There's layer upon layer of these koshas, or layers of intelligence, beginning with this Annamaya. One of the symptoms in the Bhagavad Gita that Krishna defines as intelligence, one of the items he describes, is the perception of the evil of birth and death. There's a verse in the Gita where Krishna outlines about 20 different items of intelligence. He lists all these. And one of them is the perception of evil of birth and death. He also includes old age and disease. That to have a perception of the evil of these things, as Krishna says, is intelligent. In other words, to understand that our real nature is not to just keep continually taking birth, going through a period of time in the body and then being forced out of the body to take another body again and again. And each time you're born deep into the material modes. For the soul who wants to have a go at being independent of the Supreme Lord, we know, here we all are, having a go at trying to be independent of the Supreme Lord. Now, Krishna's energy has two potencies. One of them is called Prakshipatmika Shakti. Prakshipatmika Shakti. That's called the throwing potency. That it enables her, that material energy, throws the living entity deep into the material world. It immerses the soul in materialistic life. That's why we're born into that situation. We have no remembrance of our real self, of thousands, millions of other bodies. I was thinking that it's actually Krishna serving our misplaced desire, that if you want to be independent, well, you can't have this memory of Krishna there in front of you, right? It's sort of, how could you be independent while you're continually remembering, well, I used to be a servant of Krishna, or I've had so many births. So we are thrown into the material energy, and all that remembrance of other births, of our real nature, is gone. Or it's deep inside, put it that way. I was thinking, like, at some point in our life, all of us, maybe when we're 2 or 3, 4 years old, something, we start to notice, here I am, and there's other people here with me. You know, you're thrown into this material body, and gradually, like the little bub outside there, he has no idea yet, apart from his mum. He has, and maybe the dad, he's got no idea of all these other people around, other creatures. So at some point we sort of realize, we gradually get some little consciousness. There's people around me, there's other creatures, but I've got absolutely zero idea of how I got here. Isn't it? That's an experience we all share. Somehow you're just there, in the human body, and I'm just starting to be aware of the outside world. First you're just aware of your own little family. This immersion into the material energy I've written down here, it's really thorough. If we had memory of being Krishna's servant, then we couldn't pursue this idea of trying to be independent. Maya's other Shakti is called Avana Atmika Shakti. She covers the individual soul's original pure consciousness. She covers this consciousness with whatever material desires are there within our heart. I'm quoting there our very own Padma Devi. I thought she might have been here today. Padma, you all know Padma. She wrote an article for BTG when she was talking about these two energies in her article. That was her word. She said, the Avana Atmika Shakti covers with our individual nature, our real nature, with whatever material desires are there. We're covered by those. When we look back at the beginning of our life, We're immersed in the consciousness of the body and the desires that come with it. And I was thinking for most of us, maybe with the exception of young babies born into a devotee family, but for those of us who weren't, we're surrounded by a family who all seem to have these same type of desires, just trying to satisfy the senses. But for a very small number of people, Krishna says it's like, I think we worked out yesterday, it's about 1 in a million. 1 in a million people try and understand the nature of the self. 1 in 1,000, he said, is even interested in this. So most people outside of here, they're busy. They're like, yeah, no, that's very good what you've got to say. I'm just a bit busy, thank you. I'm not all that interested. I'm trying to save up to pay the mortgage, or I want to buy something, whatever. They're not all that interested. And of those that are interested, Krishna says, hardly one actually ends up knowing me in truth. So for this very small number of people, someone may become doubtful about the identity that we've adopted. All of you came to this point where you started to doubt who I think I am. It's like we start to think, maybe that's not my real identity. We've been, layers upon layers of stuff have been put on us from the time a young baby, all these different identities, male, female, young, old. We're surrounded by this atmosphere that encourages us to think that I'm a particular nationality, this is my identity, the body. So Prabhupada in today's purport says, the study to determine one's identity, whether that identity is spiritual or material, begins in doubt. I start to question whether the body is who I am. While I was getting some notes ready for the class, the reality of the body with all the innards and the workings. Apparently inside of me, there's about 8.5 meters of intestines and stuff all inside, packed inside there. Imagine 8.5 meters. And I'm thinking, this is who I am? All this plumbing? So Prabhupada says, when one is able to analyze his actual position, the false identification with the body is detected. The verse mentions the word viparasya, or misapprehension. That we come to the conclusion that I've made a mistake. This is not who I really am. And then from Prabhupada's purport in today's verse, he says, when this false identification is detected, then real identification can be understood. And this, he said, this real understanding is called nishchayaha. By applying our intelligence to doubt these things that have been put upon us since childhood, then we come up with, he says, he calls it experimental knowledge or proved knowledge. And we can run that experiment on ourselves, like there's that famous verse in the Gita, chapter 2, verse 13. How to find our real identity, or the test. That famous verse, Dahinoshmin jatadehe. You all know that one? Kumaram yovanam jara. Tatadi hantara prapti. Dearest tatra namoyati. As the embodied soul continually passes in this body, boyhood to youth to old age, the soul similarly passes into another body at death. So we all have that experience of dwelling within this machinery that's changing before our very eyes. We all have that experience that the body's changing moment by moment, but that there's something within, the dweller within the body, the witness, which is not changing. When we look at a picture of ourselves, an old picture, it's like shocking how much the body's changed. Like I came across a picture of myself, it wasn't so many years ago, but I had black hair. I'm holding a little baby she's now like in her late 30s. It's just amazing how the body is just changing so fast. The Bhagavatam uses 3 different analogies to illustrate how the body's changing. It uses the analogy of a candle, the river, and the fruit on a tree. All of these things we look at as if there's something substantial there, something that's permanent. But like, think of a candle. There's a flame there, right? You're looking at the candle, the flame of the candle, and it seems like, well, that's a permanent thing. It's a flame. But if you come back again in 10 minutes, the candle's burnt down. So that means that the flame is continually consuming the wax of the candle. The flame is continually changing. Or the fruit on a tree, like all these mangoes on outside here. You first look at them, they're a greeny colour. You look at them a week later, they're changed. So it's going through change all the time. Or the river, that's the third example. If you go down to the bottom in the river, and you look at the river, there's a river there. But if you turn your head and look back again, every element of water in that river is different, isn't it? All the water that you looked at a few minutes ago is way down there now. So the body's like that. It's just rushing the changes that are going on. So these doubts in our mind don't have to indicate some weakness. It's okay to have doubt. It can be our intelligence questioning our choices. These doubts, they can be deep existential doubts. I was thinking, even as we practice our devotional service, things can come up that cause a doubt. Maybe you're placed into a difficult situation, or some other individual you're with creates some disturbance for your mind. Someone does something that's disturbing. Or even a section of the Shastra pops up and it can challenge us. But we're not expected to accept all these things blindly. Also, I read recently, the Shastra, it reassures us, like sometimes when you read a verse and you just feel so reassured of the reality of that. It just describes our nature. But sometimes the Shastra comes up with stuff that's pretty challenging. And you're thinking, whoa, okay. So these things, when they pop up, these doubts on a sort of short-term basis like that, it's described that we have to learn to reveal our minds in confidence to another devotee. So you sort of have to pick a devotee that you trust, and you reveal your mind in confidence to them. Maybe bring to light any misgivings or difficulties. And as a devotee, if someone does reveal their mind to us, we have to respect that so deeply that we don't betray that confidence. It's really important. So in the purport, Srila Prabhupada enlarges on how we can use doubt successfully. He says, when this false identification is detected, then the real identity can be understood. I think all of us have had this experience of hearing that false knowledge that we were living by, that having that exposed. That all of us, at some point in our life, we met another devotee, or we're given a book we heard from the Bhagavatam or the Bhagavad Gita, and that false knowledge that we'd grown up with, that we hadn't really thought about, it was challenged, it was exposed. I can remember for myself the first time ever meeting the devotees down in Melbourne. And it was a Sunday feast program, and somebody was giving a class from the Bhagavad Gita. And when I first met them, I was thinking, wow, these guys are really advanced. They really got all this stuff down. And when I thought back on it years later, the oldest of them might have been a devotee for 3 or 4 years. But when you hear that philosophy from the Bhagavad Gita or the Bhagavatam for the first time, it's totally amazing. It's like if you hear that, how can you just put that aside? Krishna says, this is who you really are. So we're going to go on and sort of, I guess you could work hard at trying to forget that, trying to cover it up. But for all of us, having that knowledge or our misidentification exposed led us on this path. We're all here now because of that. Initially, that understanding is somewhat theoretical. Like, how many times have you heard that you're not these bodies? Well, at least for me, you walk outside, bang, I'm thinking on the body again. But gradually, as we perform our sadhana, as we stick to the path, we chant our rounds, that experience becomes less theoretical. We start to experience that reality. It does come about. Prabhupada in the purport points out a situation where we shouldn't be doubting, where doubt doesn't help us. He said, doubting is not very favourable when information is received from a proper source, like when we hear from Shastra. So initially, as a young devotee maybe, as we take up this process, there can be doubts that are still there. But the idea is we just put those doubts on hold for the moment. We suspend those doubts just for the time being. And as we practice our sadhana, gradually the truths in the Shastra that's been put forward, these truths are revealed to us. Not in a theoretical way, but you start to experience them. I remember having an old teacher, an art teacher. He used to use this phrase. He'd be talking to us about something. He'd say, suspend your disbelief. Because we'd all be sitting there and he'd be talking about drawing or something like that. And what he would be saying would be challenging what you thought. So we all hang on pretty tightly to those ideas we already have. So we have to learn to suspend our disbelief. Though some of the old ideas, they're deeply rooted. We've had thousands and thousands of births, according to Krishna, identifying with the material energy. Prabhupada, there's one phrase that really hit me from Srila Prabhupada. He said, we identify with matter. Isn't that amazing? That I'm thinking of this sort of stuff, or this stuff, as being, the living entity. There's one verse that describes, I can't find it again, but it described at a funeral. Someone questions someone, what are you lamenting? There's the body laying right there, but still you're lamenting. And the person says, no, but the person that we loved is not there anymore. That's quite obvious, just the body's there. But then if you think about it, that means that the real person, the person that's animating this body, the living entity, is always invisible to us. Isn't it? All we can see is the symptoms of the soul within the body. That energy, that enlivenment that comes because of the presence of the soul. In the same way that we often describe, you can't see the wind, you can only see the symptoms of the wind or the air moving. Leaves are blowing, the grass is moving. You can't see the wind though. So we can't see the spirit soul. We can only, there's evidence that it's there. But still. So Krishna talks about doubt in the Bhagavad Gita. And he leads up to this verse where he does talk about doubt with a couple of verses. In chapter 4, verse 38, he's talking about the beauty of transcendental knowledge. He says, in the verse, he says, there is nothing so sublime and pure as transcendental knowledge. And I'm thinking, despite Krishna is telling me this is the highest thing to achieve, transcendental knowledge, still I'm thinking of material security. I'm thinking of, material comfort, possessions. But Krishna says, there is nothing so sublime and pure as transcendental knowledge. He continues, he says, and one who has achieved this knowledge, who has stuck with it, who has achieved this transcendental knowledge, enjoys the self within themselves in the due course of time. So he's reassuring us the result of attaining this transcendental knowledge is that we will come to the point where we enjoy the self within yourself in due course of time. And I thought that word too, he enjoys the self, is really important. Why does Krishna say he will enjoy the self? Because the nature of the self is really blissful, isn't it? That the spirit soul is described as Satchidananda. One of those qualities is Ananda. That as we get in touch with that nature that's not the body, we start to get a tiny, tiny little glimmer of experience that the soul is actually, that experience is really blissful. That we're not going up with the modes of nature like so, like you're in the ocean. Actually, you just get to that platform where you're experiencing something that's not changing. To enjoy the self. For example, in the Gayatri verse that we chant or 3 times a day, there's one verse to the spiritual master. It says, "Let me try and understand my spiritual master, who is always absorbed in blissful Krishna consciousness and who has enthused us." There's not a time when somebody who's on that platform is not blissfully absorbed in spiritual understanding. That's a symptom of someone on that platform. They're not going up and down. Someone who's going up and down means they're not on that platform of experiencing the self. He's absorbed, always absorbed in blissful Krishna consciousness, and because of that he has enthused us. That's the nature of the transcendentalist. So that was verse 38. Krishna talks about this experiencing the self. In the next verse, verse 39, he says, "A faithful person who is absorbed in transcendental knowledge and who subdues their senses quickly attains spiritual peace." The word in the verse, the Sanskrit word is Shraddhavan, which means a person with faith or faithful. The word is derived from the adjective from Shraddha, which means faith or trust. I've heard in classes the word Shraddha is defined as where we put our heart. So this person who Krishna described, who has faith in the process, who has absorbed themselves in transcendental knowledge, and there's that caveat, who has worked to subdue their senses, will quickly attain the spiritual peace. So none of us begin the process with subdued senses, at least speaking for myself. It takes work. It takes a fair bit of effort, isn't it, to get the senses under control. Again and again. Krishna says we can subdue them, the senses and the mind, by constant practice and by detachment. So he's setting the goal and the process of how to do it in front of us. And in the next verse, verse 40, he talks about doubt. Krishna says, "The ignorant and faithless persons who doubt the revealed scriptures do not attain God consciousness. For the doubting soul, there is happiness neither in this world nor the next." So in other words, if I doubt what Krishna's offering, if I doubt of what he's saying, what I should really do with myself, that I should absorb myself in transcendental knowledge, subdue my senses and just follow the process. If I doubt that, then I won't achieve happiness either in the rest of this life. It'll always be that struggle, just constantly trying to satisfy the senses. And as we know, the senses are satisfied for a very short time. And then it needs something new. In the beginning, our following of the process doesn't have to be perfect. It's not often perfect, at least again, speaking from my own self, it's not perfect. But here's a purport from Srila Prabhupada. Again, Bhagavad Gita, chapter 3, verse 31. He says, "An ordinary man with firm faith, or lady, in the eternal instructions of the Lord, even though unable to execute such orders, becomes liberated from the bondage of the law of karma." He says, in the beginning of Krishna consciousness, this is Prabhupada's purport, in the beginning of Krishna consciousness, one may not fully discharge the injunctions of the Lord. One may not fully discharge the injunctions of the Lord. But because that person is not resentful of this principle and works sincerely without consideration of defeat or hopelessness, he says he will surely be promoted to the stage of pure Krishna consciousness. So even you can't do it perfectly in the beginning, you keep at it. And Prabhupada says there, surely you will be promoted to the stage of pure Krishna consciousness if you just keep at it. going back to that verse number 40, where Krishna says, for the doubting soul. So Prabhupada goes further, he says, we can attain that faith that Krishna's talking about. That faith that to absorb ourselves, that's my strongest faith, that all I need to do is absorb myself in transcendental knowledge. Prabhupada says we can attain that level of faith by performing devotional service and chanting Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. So the thing we can't do is to just sit on the fence. It doesn't work for very long. Spiritual life is dynamic. It's like if the train pulls up, the carriage doors open, you put one foot into the carriage, you got to make a decision, isn't it? There and then, quickly. You got to keep going, step in or step back, because the train's not going to hang around. So we can't just sit on the fence. Or another expression that said, you can't taste the blissfulness of this process by licking the jar of honey from the outside. You actually have to enter into the process. Prabhupada, in one of the purports I was reading, he says, there are people who can cite passages from, they can chant so many different verses, but he says, but actually they don't have faith in the words. This was Prabhupada's, he said, when somebody asked him, a lady asked him back in, I think, 1960 something, whether he could recommend a Bhagavad Gita to her. And he said there have been so many different volumes, editions of the Bhagavad Gita, but not a single one made a devotee of Krishna. So how can you recommend one of those books to someone? The entire Bhagavad Gita says, become my friend, worship me. Become my friend, become my devotee, bow down to me. Today, we understand there are tens of thousands of devotees all over the world. There are Hare Krishnas in practically every city on the planet now. So it's like, okay, they're there now. But during the time of Prabhupada's guru, Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj, that wasn't the case. There weren't devotees all over the world. There were only devotees more or less in India. And there weren't very many of them either. And yet all of the devotees, they knew of Lord Chaitanya's prediction. Anyone chant the prediction for me? You know the translation? In every town and village on the surface of the globe, my name will be broadcast. This is Lord Chaitanya's prediction. So imagine, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj had sent his disciples to Europe to try and spread this Krishna consciousness. They made one, maybe two devotees. But nothing was really established there. So, Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj, his other disciples were thinking, the other devotees were thinking, well, this prediction of Lord Chaitanya, maybe it's like a folk story, or it's nice to think about, but we're in India, there's only a few devotees here. The rest of the world, as Bhagavad Ashraya said the other day, the entire world is the Western world these days. Western values in every town you go to. So, Prabhupada had faith in his Guru's order to spread this Krishna consciousness. And Prabhupada said, I couldn't understand how it could possibly happen. He said, I have been given this impossible task by my spiritual master. An impossible task. But somehow or other, even though he had this impossible task put upon him, he goes to America with faith in his Guru's words that somehow this is going to happen. And in that first year or so, it didn't look very reassuring, did it? Some of his stuff was stolen. He had nothing. But now, there are devotees in every part of the planet simply because of Prabhupada's unbelievable faith in the order of his Guru. So Shraddha, the word faith, means where we put our heart. It's not that someone has faith and someone else doesn't. It's just a question of where we put our heart, where we put our faith. Whether I have faith that that politics will solve all these problems, or mundane education, or if I just get enough good possessions, or my social position, or if I'm materially comfortable. But we're advised by the Shastra to put our faith in the words of the scripture and in just trying to serve the spiritual master, and that all will be revealed to us. Krishna tells us that. He says, if we just apply to the process, we will enjoy the self within ourself. To quote Krishna again, he says, a faithful person who is absorbed in this transcendental knowledge and who subdues their senses, so that struggle to subdue your senses is worth the effort. He says that person will quickly attain supreme spiritual peace. And Krishna says, where is the question of happiness if you haven't managed to achieve peace? Prabhupada says in the purport to that verse, he says, one is called a faithful person who thinks that simply by acting in Krishna consciousness, they will attain the highest perfection. Everything will be achieved if we just become Krishna conscious. Anyone have any questions or any comments they'd like to make? Any?
Thank you, Prabhu, for class. It's interesting how how the verse itself describes the functions of the intelligence. First one is doubt.
Yeah.
And then we can say that produces misapprehension. Doubts are condemned in the Bhagavad Gita and the Shastras. But then there's a correct apprehension. And then the word used here is nischaya. And that word is used several in other places. Rupa Goswami Utsaha Nischayat Dharyat. And it's interesting how the word may have apparently sort of different but similar meanings. Here it is translated as correct apprehension, and there it's confidence. Confidence. And in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, when Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is instructing Sanatana Goswami, he defines Shraddha with that same word. Shraddha Shabda Koe, Nischayat, that certain is as, certainty, when we have faith in something certain. So it seems like what we're aiming for is the correct apprehension. That's the ultimate useful function of the intelligence. It sounds from what the verse says and the way that Prabhupada elaborates in his purport. So I just thought that.
I really like the way you use the word certainty.
Yeah.
As an similarly for the word faith.
Yeah.
That's what, if we follow the process bit by bit, chanting, hearing nicely, that experience of certainty develops within the heart. Even something that comes before you that's difficult to deal with, whatever. But there's a certainty there. You can see the modes of nature working. There's no more doubt about the reality of this philosophy, that how it's working, moment by moment. There's a certainty. You're experiencing it. It's not that you've learnt how to repeat a verse enough times that you can just as Krishna says, this is the king of education because you experience the self by direct perception. In the same way when we have breakfast, we all know we've had brekkie. You would taste the self by direct perception. Any other? Certainty. Thank you.
Thank you, Puru, for the class. When you say tasting the self, it kind of makes me feel a bit, I want to understand a bit more because, the soul's described like, 1/10,000th tip of a hair. but then it's also described how we have an eternal nature. There's in Krishna's pastimes and things like this. So then it seems like there's a step between the self and also realizing who we truly are. Like, so how do we understand this, and how also this is kind of related, but a bit of a second question. How does the individual nature relate to the soul also? Like, you know, what way we're inclined to do service, for example?
My understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of our individual nature as far as is really a product of just a gazillion lives of material conditioning, that stuff I'm exhibiting at the moment. But as far as experiencing our real nature, the nature of our individual self, my understanding is that you don't have to sort of try extraneously or separately. It will just come. That as we chant, bit by bit, as long as we chant sincerely, like in last class I gave, I'd come across where Prabhupada says, mechanical chanting won't give us love of God. He said it can lift you above the modes of nature, but we have to get to the point of attentive chanting, careful chanting, mindful chanting, and that process will gradually, you'll get an experience of who you really are. My understanding is you can't shortcut it, that it'll come when we're ready. I don't know, does that answer what you were asking?
Yeah, that's helpful. But it feels like everything in Krishna consciousness has minute ways of guiding you. So,
Yeah.
but to then just leave this kind of section, which is like the biggest point, to just it will come. It feels like there's many things that are kind of getting left out.
I mean, my experience also is of trying to be a devotee over the years, is that Maya Devi is a pure devotee. And every time I've stepped off the path, she does her job. She gives me a really good slap. You feel devastated. You're like, oh, I've just got to get back on that path. Like I just jumped into ignorance. So we're helped from within and without. Okay, thank you so much, Prabhu. Hare Krishna.